Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Ecology Live. I'm Mark Cadotte. I'm the Chair of Applied Ecology Resources, which is a new online resource, as well as the Editor-in-Chief of the journal Ecological Solutions and Evidence, both published by the British Ecological Society. If this is your first time joining us, you're very welcome. And welcome back to all the Ecology Live regulars. Thanks again to NHBS, who are generously sponsoring today's lecture. They supply equipment and books for ecologists and conservation professionals. They're offering free European shipping for Ecology Live viewers and have extended this offer until the end of September. There'll be details at the very end of this talk on how you can take advantage of this offer. We're excited to announce that one of our journals, the Journal of Animal Ecology, has a new open call for papers for a special feature on understanding climate change response in the age of genomics. To find out more, go to the Journal of Animal Ecology webpage or search for Animal Ecology Genomics special feature. The deadline for submissions is December 11th. I'll shortly hand over to our speaker, Alexandra Harmon-Threatt, who's giving today's seminar. But let me first quickly say that we're recording this talk and we'll post it to YouTube afterwards. There'll be a short question and answer period at the end of the 25-minute talk for those watching live. Please do submit your questions during the talk at any time in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There's no need to wait till the end of the talk. Your questions can be named or anonymous. You can select. I'll then pick a couple of questions to ask Alexandra at the end of the session, and we'll see how many we can get through. Without waiting any longer, let me introduce today's speaker, Alexandra Harmon-Threatt from the University of Illinois, who's going to tell us about the role of soil in bee conservation. Alexandra, over to you.
Thanks so much, Mark. I'm just gonna. All right, hopefully everyone can see my slides now. Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate people taking time out of their day to wherever you are on the planet right now to spend some time learning a little bit about native bees. The title of my talk today is Conserving Native Bees is a Dirty Business. And maybe the title should be a dirty business, because I'm going to try and convince you today why soil is a really critical part for bee conservation. I want to start by thanking my amazing team. I work with what I always call the best in the biz, students and postdocs and staff that really make all of the things that we do possible, because the funny thing about this photo is that the one in the center is the most recent, and I just get kind of progressively cleaner. So I'm doing less and less of the field work, less of the data collection, and more of the kind of data processing. And without all of their hard work, I wouldn't have so many interesting things to share with you today, and obviously our funding sources that keep this whole show running. Now, I always like to start by helping everyone orient themselves on what a native bee is. And honeybees have really captured our imagination, but they're not native in the Americas, right? And so although we continuously learn more and more about them, I always like to remind people that they actually have a very strange and obscure biology that's very different from most native species. And this is important because even though we keep learning things about honeybees, I just read a paper yesterday about how they were astonished that they could actually conceive and understand that there is a zero, the number zero, which is a little bit of an abstract concept, but they're able to understand that. And I'm thinking that's really cool, but as much as we learn about them, it's not really helping us that much understand the overall native bee diversity. We know that there are 20,000 bee species globally and 4,000 in the United States, and that they are really critical for pollination, particularly in natural areas. So when we're talking about pollinator declines and our concern for pollinator declines, we're really thinking about these native pollinators. Although we know honeybees are also having their own struggles, because we don't manage these pollinators, the conservation of them is very, very different. Now, there are some major differences in life history between honeybees and native bees that make conservation for them particularly challenging. So things like sociality. Most people think of bees and think about hives. But most native pollinators are actually solitary with a single female creating and provisioning their own nest. They're actually very small in size. There's a lot of size variation in native bees in general, but most of them are actually much smaller than honeybees. If you think about the susceptibility to things like pesticides, size really matters. So again, if we're orienting ourselves around honeybees, we're actually maybe really limiting our understanding of susceptibility to certain things. And then also where they place their nests. So most honeybees nest in large, if they're not in nest boxes like we're accustomed to, they're in large cavities, probably in trees. And where your nest is placed has a huge effect on how your susceptibility to various anthropogenic disturbances. So if you're nesting in the soil, you may actually be more buffered from various climatic changes. And this is where these things become really important, these differences in life history trade. And that's why it's important for us to really change our mindset from honeybees to thinking about native pollinators, because they are just so different. Now, all of these things are going to be really important for trying to come up with conservation efforts. But the thing that I really focus on is soil nesting. Soil nesting is largely overlooked in conservation, but we know that it's incredibly critical to success. And this is in part because most bees are spending about 90% of their life cycle in the nest or in contact with nesting materials. So this is an idealized graphic of native bee life cycle where a female is actually digging a nest, provisioning it, laying an egg, that egg is developing, and then that bee is later on emerging. And so they're spending a lot of time either in the nest itself or in contact with nesting materials. And there's some evidence, some studies have found that mortality while nesting can exceed 80%. So bees are spending lots of time in their nests. Most bees are nesting below ground, over 80%. And the mortality while nesting, it can exceed 80%. And so we know that this is actually going to be a really critical part of their life cycle. Unfortunately, for most native species, we actually lack very much information on their nesting. I recently conducted a review where I looked at a subset of native bee species here in North America and found that for 75%, we actually had no information on their nests whatsoever. And then for the other 25%, we did have some information, but often it was really scant. Like it would just mention, oh, I found this nest in the ground, and that maybe is the only thing we know about nesting for that species. And even in the cases where we found multiple nests that had been excavated for a single species, oftentimes that information was actually contradictory. So in two different locations, the bee nest may actually have very different depths and forms and shapes and things that are really important. And so we actually just don't know very much at all about native bees and where they place their nests, despite how important it is to their survival and environments. Now, I'm not the first person to bring this up. In a paper by Simon Potts in 2005, he had this really beautiful statement of clearly nesting resources in addition to foraging resources need to be considered when examining the organization of bee communities. However, relatively little effort has been focused upon the complementary and critical need for nesting resource provision. Now that was over 15 years, that was 15 years ago that was written, and I would say that despite this very clear call for us to be doing more to understand native bee nesting and this need of this specific resource, we haven't come very far. And this is despite a lot of concern about declines of bees due to things like climate change, land use change, and parasites and pathogens. Now, all of these things also interact with one another in really interesting ways. We know that in the review I mentioned before, I really go and dig into a lot of these kind of factors and how they might interact. But in part, just for example, we know that climate change is actually going to increase the presence of parasites and pathogens and nest parasites for a lot of native pollinators, and that's of a major concern. But the nest, particularly the soil, is a major mediator of a lot of these anthropogenic disturbances, right? Like again, how sensitive you might be to climate change might have to do with where your nest is, how deep your nest is, and also the kinds of parasites and pathogens you're interacting with. So again, we have to really get into the nest part to really start understanding the full effect that bees might be experiencing in these environments. And so as part of this, my lab has transitioned from looking at native bees in this way, where we're standing up, looking at flowers, netting bees off flowers. And we do still do quite a bit of this, but we've also started doing a lot more of this, where we're taking soil cores, doing a lot more digging, using these emergence tents to actually measure how many bees are emerging out of the soil in various locations to try and understand any kind of preference for nesting in a particular place. And this has really revolutionized our understanding of conservation benefits and conservation concerns for native pollinators. Now, we mostly center our work on land use change and the triangle of things that I mentioned before. We're mostly on this area of land use change, but not just the destruction of environments, also the restoration of environments, because I think that that is really important. Now, this photo that I have featured here is a very classic Illinois landscape. That's where I am right now. And on the left side is a restored prairie, and on the right side is a soybean field. So most of the crops in Illinois are either corn or soy. And you see that there is nothing separating those whatsoever. The restored area, the kind of yellowish area on the left, is right up against the soybean field on the right. And that means that there's going to be a lot of interchange between them. What's happening on the soybean field is going to be affecting the restored area. What's happening in the restored area, whether or not you're increasing your parasitoids or other things, that's going to be affecting what's happening in the soybean field. Now, Illinois is really dominated by tallgrass prairie, and that's where most of my work really centers, because tallgrass prairie is a quintessential American habitat. That word prairie is actually most often used to describe grasslands in Illinois, in America, and not really used to describe grasslands area at other places. But tallgrass prairie is also one of the most endangered habitats on the planet. Between 83 to 99% of this habitat has been converted to agriculture. So in some places, almost none of the original landscape is remaining. These fragments are very small and surrounded by monoculture. So we know that there's very little of that habitat. There's very little connectivity between most of it. And climate change is actually expected to make it hotter and wetter in these locations. So you're expected to see quite a large effect of climate change, in addition to all of the habitat fragmentation that's happened in this habitat. Now, interestingly, one of the reasons that I find this habitat super interesting to work in is that there is a ton of restoration occurring. The US government has invested a lot of time and energy and money into trying to get more prairie on the habitat, on the landscape, for lots of reasons, but, and that means that there's gonna be a lot of conservation happening. And this provides us an opportunity to really understand how bees are responding to these newly made conservation areas. Unfortunately, though, we know very little about how restoration of land is going to be affecting bee nesting. In 2016, with a student, Kristen Chen, we questioned land managers about how they were restoring this tallgrass prairie habitat and what places they preferred. And what we found is actually they mostly like to use old cornfields. They said that it had less weed seed bank, that it was very flat, you had better establishment. And what that means, though, is that as we do conservation, we're also carrying with us all the legacy effects of whatever was on that agricultural field previously. And so when you think about, okay, where are the bees nesting, what's in those soils, most of the soils that are being restored, most of the habitat that's being restored carries a long agricultural legacy with it. Most of the sites were fairly small, just because that's what the managers could get their hands on. And then because they're small and they're former agricultural fields, they're in a landscape that's dominated by agriculture. And that means that they're actually highly fragmented, right? And they're gonna have all of these effects of the agriculture around them. In addition to this, many management methods were used to restore and maintain these habitats. And so we got really interested in trying to understand how those might affect bee conservation and native bee nesting in particular. So some of the things that they were using included tilling, burning, grazing, a lot of agrochemical use, including herbicides, and also a variety of seed diversity efforts to try and increase and establish these habitats. And I won't get into the seed diversity today, but I have some other work looking at how that might influence nesting in these areas. And ultimately, the goal is for us is to try and understand, if we build it, if we restore a habitat, will they come? And even going beyond that, the real question is, if we build it, will they thrive? Because we don't want to just be drawing bees into a habitat. We want them to be living there, making their nest there, particularly those that nest in the soil, since over 80% of the bees do nest in the soil. We want them to come there and we want them to thrive. Now that means increasing nesting and the success of nesting in these habitats, but then also hopefully decreasing, and I'll tell the story about that with a story about grazing in particular, because grazing is a very commonly used management method in restored habitats. But also we want to decrease mortality, right? That we can't just increase nesting, we need to also decrease mortality. And although I have mortality displayed here as a bee being killed by a praying mantis, I'm still thinking about within the nest mortality. I've not found a good in the nest mortality picture. If anyone has an idea, please send that to me. I spent like 2 hours on this yesterday, and I just had to go back to my original picture. But I'm going to be talking telling a little bit of a story about soil contaminants and how that might be affecting mortality, and some of the ideas that we're trying to figure out if we can help reduce mortality. Now, restored habitats must be managed. We live in such an anthropogenically dominated landscape that if a habitat isn't managed, it will get overrun with invasive species, and so they have to be managed. Now, tallgrass prairie is most often managed with burning, but then burning is often paired with haying and grazing. And these management techniques can really affect key nesting conditions for bees. Things like soil temperature, soil moisture, compaction. You think about a habitat that's been burned, might allow more light penetration, and how that might affect soil temperature and soil moisture and things like that. Now, those are things that are known to be really important for nesting conditions, for where a bee places its nest, but we were really interested in kind of this intersection between management and nesting, which had never been explored before. So we asked this question, can the management of these habitats affect bee nesting? And we had 3 treatments, burning, haying, and patch burn grazing. So patch burn grazing is a particular management method in which small patches of a habitat are burned, and that increases the cattle moving from one area of the patch to another. So I hope you can see my mouse here. So in year 1, if this dark green patch is burned, that causes a flush of grasses, the cattle move to that area. And then in year 2, this area is burned and the cattle kind of rotate around. So we sampled both the year 1 and the year 3 because we thought there may be some differences in the level of disturbance after a burn and with the different levels of grazing that these areas might experience. Now, in particular here, we were interested in soil factors. So we measured many things about the soil, and we reduced it to just the first principal component. But we measured things that we knew were really important, that had been previously reported as being important for bees. Things like moisture, compaction, soil type, how bare the ground was, and also pH. And then we were able to use this soil principal component to look at how it influences things like nesting as well and floral abundance. Now this was ended up being a really interesting story in which we found that management really altered the soil and the floral resources that were important to bees. You can particularly see this in the floral abundance. In areas that are grazed, this patch burn grazing year 1 and year 3, we see a large decrease in the amount of flowers that are available. And in the soil characteristics, we see a lot of variability in how management is affecting the soil. So those areas that had not been grazed for 2 years after burning actually had the lowest soil values. And this is actually ends up being really quite a bad thing. It also affected, the changes in the soil also affected floristic quality. So floristic quality was, this is a measure of basically how high quality the plants are in the sites, whether or not you see a lot of rare plants that are actually difficult to establish. And so the higher the soil value for that principal component, the more of these high quality plants we were seeing in these habitats. And also, this was kind of a complicated one, but nesting rate was affected both by the soil values and by the floral abundance. And so when we put all this together, what we found is that grazing seemed to have adverse effects on both the floral community and the soil characteristics. And this seemed to negatively affect bee nesting, ground nesting in these areas. And so when we're thinking about management, if we're putting habitat on the land, we need to think not just about getting the habitat on, but how are we going to maintain that habitat over the long term in order to be able to conserve pollinators. So that's my first story. I'm going to move on to talking a little bit about mortality in this and how chemicals in soils may affect mortality. Now, I showed this picture before of the adjacent tallgrass prairie and the soybean habitat and the kind of drift that may be happening or interaction that may be happening between these two. One of the big concerns right now, and particularly in Illinois, where corn and soy is the predominant agriculture, and we know that there's a lot of neonics going into those crops, is that the dust can actually contain high levels of neonicotinoids and contaminate adjacent plantings. And this is an issue because only less than 20% of the neonics that are applied to these crops actually stay on the crops or are taken up by the crops. Most of it ends up either blowing into these adjacent habitats or moving through the water table into these adjacent habitats, which means that as we're restoring tallgrass prairie, particularly in these areas that are on former agricultural fields or adjacent to former agricultural fields, there is the possibility for them to get really contaminated with neonics. And so for this, my student Nick Anderson worked incredibly hard over 2 years to look at 2 different species of bees, Osmia lignaria and Megachile rotundata. Now these are bees are actually very easy to work with. They are traditionally considered cavity nesting, but there's a lot of evidence that they do use cavities below ground. And so they actually may experience some direct contact with contaminated soil, contaminated soils. And for 2 years, Nick basically exposed them to extremely small amounts of the larvae to very small amounts of neonics and track their survival, growth, and development. And through this cuticular exposure, he wanted to basically mimic the levels that we were seeing in soil. So he used 4 different levels of imidacloprid, which is a neonicotinoid, and he, like I said, he meticulously every few days added a very small drop just to the bee surface to try and see if they weren't feeding on neonics, which is the kind of more traditional way that people do neonic exposures, but if they were in a contaminated environment, how would they survive? Now, really quickly, I want to orient you to these graphs because I'm going to show a few of them. This is the proportion, these are survival graphs, so this is the proportion surviving, and obviously zero surviving is a very bad thing, and then the time that we ran this experiment over was 2 weeks. And what we found was that those that were exposed to these low and moderate levels actually seemed to survive better than those that were not exposed at all. Now that seems maybe a little bit counterintuitive, but this what's called a hormetic response is actually very common for bees. It seems that something about being exposed to small amounts of chemicals can actually seem to ramp up something about their immune system and maybe make them do a little bit better. But when they are exposed to high levels, they actually do see higher mortality. And this was for the osmia. Now, in contrast, the megachile females actually did not see any differences. And that's interesting because what it tells us is that life history really matters. These bees have very different life histories. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that before. The osmia develop actually very quickly and the megachile develop very slowly, and how they respond to these pesticides actually seems to really be influenced by their life history. And I guess in contrast, the male megachile actually survived longer at the highest concentrations. So this was a bit of a quizzical response, but I always like to remind people that there are fates other than death, right? Like you can live a long time by never moving and never mating and never doing anything. And so just because you live a long time doesn't necessarily mean it's good for you in any way. But it does show us that that life history matters, right? Like whether or not you are a fast developing female or a slow developing female really changes your response to these soil levels of contamination. It also tells us that these particular exposures through the soils might be actually an important, completely overlooked exposure for bees, right? This is something that people have not really been looking at, and it's something that we maybe should be extremely concerned about because we do see differences in mortality. So where do we go from here? In our lab, you know, we've been doing lots of different experiments looking at native pollinators and how the soils are affecting their survival, but we really wanted to start putting some of these pieces together. And so this is a little hard to see, but if you can see all of these grids here, there are 96 of them. This is a large scale experiment that we've put together to try and see if we can manipulate soils to look at differences in nesting, mortality, and the degradation of pesticides as a way to better understand how soils might, and contamination of soils might actually be affecting native pollinators in these landscapes. And more importantly, we still really need to get to growth rate. One of the reasons that everyone works with honeybees is that it's actually really easy to track their survival and development. And we don't have a very good mechanism for that for native ground-dwelling bees. And so we need to really understand what happens when they live in these in the soil under a changing climate or in a contaminated landscape. Are they making fewer cells? Are those cells surviving less? Are they more likely to be parasitized? And we need to really understand that to really kind of get a fuller picture of how native pollinators are doing in these conserved areas or in these newly created habitats. So one of the ways we're trying to do this is we're working right now very diligently on reviving a method to get bees nesting between panes of glass. This allows us to actually track how well they do, how many cells they make, the fates of each of those cells, and it'll allow us to reduce the number of confounding factors. And this is a major area that we're working in right now to try and do this, to try and really better understand how soils and contaminations of soils or changes in soil temperature are affecting native pollinators and their success in various habitats. So hopefully through all of this, I've convinced you that for wild bees, it is really imperative we begin examining not just what they're doing on flowers, but also what's happening in soil. Soil is really considered like a black box for all of these, for what's happening to the bees, but because they're spending so much time there and soil is so important for mediating their interactions with the environment, it's really critical that we start looking below ground. And so we have to think about the abiotic conditions, biotic interactions, the plant community, and the chemicals that are actually in the soil and how it's affecting the native pollinators. So thank you all so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I'll be happy to take a few questions. I think we just have a few minutes.
All right, thank you very much, Alexandra. That was a really wonderful talk. We do have a bunch of questions, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to get through them all. So I will.
Sorry, Mark. Should I take down this slide and just show my face?
It's already done. So,
oh, okay.
So viewers just see you and I having a conversation. So I won't be able to get through all the questions, but I'll ask a few of them. There's a lot of people had a lot of interest and also had nice things to say about your talk. So congratulations. The first question I'm going to ask is a combination of questions that were asked by Sakik Shotri, who was asking a little bit about some of the, I guess, the broader consequences or services provided by native pollinators, and you know, even that photo that you showed where there's a restoration right beside crops. Is there a larger service or pollination benefit to having these restoration activities happening in and around agriculture?
That's a great question. I think that that really depends on the crop. So here in Illinois, where corn and soy actually don't really need pollinators, you're getting very little additional benefit to the crop itself. You get, having native habitat in general is good, right? It offers pest control and water retention and other things, soil retention. But the pollination is not necessary for the crops that we grow here. But for areas that do require pollination, Illinois is actually one of the biggest pumpkin growing states, sugar pumpkin growing states also, and sugar pumpkins actually need lots of pollination. You would see a lot of benefit for those crops of having native pollinators. There's been a lot of work by my former advisor, Claire Kremen, and Ray Winfrey about, and Alexandra Klein about the benefit of this natural areas adjacent to crop fields that need pollinators.
Great. There's a question from Edward Spevek, who was asking about in some of your studies. When you're looking at, so he could probably follow up with you directly. But he's asking about, so you're looking at diversity when you're looking at different management types. But you had a question about composition. And so how native bee composition might respond to different management regimes.
That's a great question. And I think in that paper, we found that we didn't find a lot of compositional, the bee community itself was not very different. We saw the biggest, and that was, I mean, I guess I should have gotten maybe a little more into that, but that was one of the most interesting parts of that paper, was that we didn't see in the netting data much difference in the bees. Where we really started to see the differences was when we started looking at the soils and in the nesting. So the actual composition of the community wasn't different, I don't think, from one another.
And maybe as a little bit of a follow-up on that, so one of the, I guess, the premise of some of this work is about impacts on soil. And is it the case then that there is sort of an ideal soil profile, or is heterogeneity really important? So maybe different management regimes or different effects that produce heterogeneity, and so are those native bees all using sort of the same type of soil, or is there some partitioning on the amount of clay or coarseness or other attributes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in general, we find that most bees tend to prefer a slightly sandier soil. And I really think that there has been some evidence that some bees will use like complete sand, some will use very clay heavy soils. But in general, it seems that they tend to really like a sandier soil. And I think that actually has a lot to do with moisture, because moisture is one of the biggest factors that bees have to contend with, right? Like they have to be able to they need to maintain moisture, but then also not get totally inundated with moisture constantly. And so I think having a higher sand content really allows them to kind of help moderate that moisture level, because moisture is also really important for molds, which is one of the biggest factors for mortality for bees. So slightly sandier soils that are more bare, and I think that also helps with moisture, helping them both to access the ground, but also to soils to dry out some level more regularly.
Great, thanks. In the interest of time, I think we'll have to wrap it up here. There are other questions. There are other questions that hopefully we can send you, and you can have time to respond to them. So thank you again for a really wonderful.
Thanks so much, everyone. I really enjoyed being here today.
Great, thanks a lot. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so that brings today's Ecology Live to a close. And thanks again to Alexandra for a wonderful talk. And thank you everyone for joining in and viewing this talk online. And a reminder that these talks will be put on our YouTube channel should you want to follow up and watch it again. Next week at the same time, we'll have Adam Elgar from the University of Nottingham talking to us about how the thermal choices of individual animals scale to influence global macroecological patterns. Don't miss it. Finally, I'll leave you with the details of the offer from the sponsors of today's Ecology Live talk and HBS. It's here so that you can take full advantage. And with that, thank you again for joining us and see you next Thursday.